So somebody sent me a video and I didn't fully watch it. I didn't fully pay attention to it. But what it is this seemingly made for children, introductory, summarized short video of Israel-Palestine, Palestinian history. It kind of presents itself as like Palestine101 accessible history, and it's only 4 minutes long. So when I clicked on it, and I saw that it was created by like this pro-Israel org, I knew it would be a gold mine. Let's get into it. So the video is called Origins of the Word Palestine, and it's by this channel called Stand With Us. And the description right away is casting doubt on the fact that Palestinians hold genuine indigeneity to the land. And it offers us the ability to donate to Stand With Israel, Fight Anti-Semitism. A total of $494 raised, so they are eating good tonight. But that's not what we're here to poke fun at. We are here to watch the video, see if the people who created this video know what the fuck they're talking about, and if they're wrong, correct them. So let's get right into it.
And here are these historical claims about the Palestinians.
منذ 5000 سنة والفلسطينيون في هذه الأرض.
سيدنا المسيح عليه السلام هو فلسطيني بامتياز.
In a highly politicized debate, it's worth asking, what's fact and what's fiction?
Dude, like the music too, it's obviously supposed to appeal to, if not beginners to the topic, like literal children. Who the fuck listens to this? What adult would listen to this? This is like Disney Channel introduction to Palestine.
Early versions of the name Palestine refer to a small region on the Mediterranean coast bordering Egypt and to the Philistines, an ancient Greek people that, like many others, had vanished over time and have no connection to today's Palestinians.
All right, so right away, the Philistines have no connection to today's Palestinians. I'm unsure if she's gearing up to make some sort of argument to undermine the indigeneity of modern Palestinians. I'm assuming that is what they're trying to do because of the caption and all that. But regardless, what she's saying here is not true. Traditional historical narratives posit that the Philistines were an ancient seafaring people who arrived in the Levant in the 12th century BCE and then intermixed with the indigenous groups there, like the Canaanites and so on. Modern Palestinians are the descendants of those ancient peoples. So it's not entirely true to say that they have absolutely no connection to the Philistines, as the Philistines intermixed with the other groups of the Levant thousands of years ago to the point where their distinct DNA was essentially absorbed into and merged with the indigenous population. I mean, we do actually have some relatively new historical breakthroughs and archaeology that suggests the Philistines might not have even been foreign migrants at all and actually do boast indigeneity to the region. You can learn more about that in Nur Mashalah's Palestine, a 4,000-year history, which is a really good book on the topic. Regardless if they are connected in any way to the Philistines, that's irrelevant, because what we do know for sure is that modern Palestinians share like a 75 to 88% core genetic continuity with those ancient Levantine groups. There's an academic paper on this topic by Brian Permana, and in it he concludes that today's Palestinians exhibit the highest degree of ancestral persistence and genetic continuity with the ancient peoples of the Levant of any modern population. Again, it's just ridiculous to try and even frame this as though they're just foreign to the land. They have no connection, no indigeneity. Not true. What happened? They just stayed in the region, intermixed with the various groups of conquerors and immigrants, and eventually converted to Islam, and here we are. That's modern Palestinian. Ashkenazi Jews, on the other hand, are largely European converts to Judaism, as Judaism was actually a proselytizing religion not too long ago. That's also not to say that there's no Levantine DNA in Ashkenazis. There is. But there's Levantine DNA found in Southern Italians, and you don't see me arguing that I should be able to colonize Palestine because of it. All I'm saying here is the idea of an unbroken genetic link between modern Ashkenazis and ancient Levantine peoples is much weaker than the link between modern Palestinians and the ancient indigenous groups of the Levant. There's a good passage from that Masala book that covers this. If you just give me a second, I can pull it up. Indeed, it would not be unreasonable to argue that the modern Palestinians are more likely to be the descendants of the ancient Philistines and Israelites than Ashkenazi Jews, many of whom were European converts to Judaism. Certainly historically, in contrast to the myth of exile and return, many of the original Jewish inhabitants of ancient Palestine remained in the country, but had accepted Christianity and Islam many generations later. Today, however, in contrast to the mythologized Ashkenazi Zionist and Arab nationalist historiographies, more and more archaeologists and biblical scholars are convinced that the ancestors of the Israelites had never been in Egypt and that the biblical paradigm of a military conquest of Canaan was completely fictional. Nur Masala, Palestine, a 4,000-year history. My only point here is that it's ridiculous that modern Jewish people, especially Ashkenazi Jews who more or less make up Israel's elite class, can make an exclusive claim to the land, while Palestinians, who can actually trace significantly more of their DNA to ancient Levantine populations, are treated as second-class citizens. At the end of the day, these blood and soil arguments are ridiculous, and determining who gets basic fucking human rights in the modern day based on ancient genetic lineage is stupid.
The word Palestine was first formally used by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. During his rule, Hadrian
Also not true. Like, this person is 0 for 2. In very short succession, they tried 2 claims. Both of them have failed. Palestine first being used by the Roman Emperor in 134 AD. That is completely false. The name and its cognates were in use for over 1,000 years before Hadrian's reign. The oldest written evidence of the names date back roughly 3,200 years to the late Bronze Age, and they were like Egyptian inscriptions using the cognate Peliset. Then later in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, you had Assyrian clay tablets referring to the region with more cognates like Palashtu or Pilistu. The Greek historian Herodotus used Palestine in the 5th century BCE to describe the entire tract of land from Phoenicia to Egypt. A century after that, Aristotle explicitly writing about Palestine. By the time of the Hellenistic empires, you had cartographers like Ptolemy. They were making world maps that identified Palestine as a distinct country. This is an absolute lie. A bald-faced lie.
Formally used by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. During his rule, Hadrian massacred the rebellious Jewish population in the Kingdom of Judea and sent most of the remaining Jewish population into exile.
All right, second exile myth. This is a historical myth. It's not true. There's literally no proof that the Romans exiled the Jews after either the fall of the Second Temple in 70 CE or in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was 60 years later. The Romans had no policy or means for mass deportation. They didn't have trains. They had no way. They had no logistical way to go through with these deportations. They didn't have a policy to do so anyways. Israeli historian Shlomo Sand, he put it simply once. He said something along the lines of, there's a reason not a single research-based book has ever been written on the forced uprooting of the Jewish people, because the scholarly elite know that that didn't happen. Archaeological discoveries have actually confirmed that the country was not emptied of its Jewish inhabitants and that the Jewish population recovered economically shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple. And then subsequent Jewish emigration from the region was a slow and gradual and voluntary process over centuries, rather than like some forced expulsion by Romans or Byzantine authorities. On top of this, the supposed Jewish, diaspora, quote-unquote diaspora, existed long before 70 CE, and the dispersal of the Jews did not begin with the destruction of the Second Temple. They were already in the diaspora prior to that. In fact, the concept of the exile in Jewish mythology was actually Christian theology. It was a Christian theological invention that was later adopted by Jews. And some people who abided by this, the concept of exile in Jewish mythology, was also, for a long period of time, meant to refer symbolically to punishment. Exile could be anywhere. Exile could even be in the land. You could still be exiled. Exile was not seen as a physical material description at the time. It was seen more as a metaphor.
In the Kingdom of Judea and sent most of the remaining Jewish population into exile. Hadrian was determined to obliterate thousands of years of Jewish presence in the land that is documented with extensive archaeological findings and place names we still use today. And so, he decided to rename the province of Judea, Syria-Palestina, after the vanished nemesis of the ancient Jews, the Philistines.
So this is the claim. Hadrian used the name to spite the Jews, and this is where the name comes from. Okay, wrong. The name was already a common part of the Roman vocabulary long before the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE. In the early 1st century CE, the Roman poet Ovid repeatedly used the term in his poems. In 43 CE, the Roman geographer Pomponius Mela explicitly wrote about, quote, the Arabs of Palestine. So what Hadrian actually did was he merged together a couple of provinces to create a major administrative province named Syria-Palestina. This would be akin to elevating a pre-existing title to an administrative role, not inventing it, and not solely for the purpose of insulting the Jews. In fact, there's actually no evidence that Hadrian gave any sort of order or decree to rename the region Syria-Palestina specifically and solely to spite the Jews. That just doesn't exist. It was more of a practical administrative decision, and some historians just accepted the narrative that, this move had the additional effect of obscuring the Jewish character of the land. It's based on circumstantial evidence, nothing concrete. Historian Zachary Foster, in our No Politic Here podcast episode we did a few weeks ago, he explained this. He said that there's no evidence that Hadrian ever gave this decree. This is based on circumstantial evidence. We have no way of proving this. The real reason Hadrian chose to use the name was simply because it was already the most common 1,000-year-old geopolitical designation for the wider region, and it was used by the Greeks and the Roman geographers and historians. That's why.
Judea was the last independent state that existed in the land. Century after century, the remaining Jews, as well as other groups, lived under the rule of successive foreign powers. During the time of the Ottoman Empire, the word Palestine was used as a general geographical term describing the land south of Syria. So when that area fell into the hands of the British at the end of World War I, it was only natural that they named it Palestine. The League of Nations, a predecessor to the UN, granted the victorious World War I powers mandates to control the Middle East and prepare the local peoples for independence.
Do you notice how this person doesn't actually take any issue with what they just said? They just say that like it's a normal thing to do. That, oh yeah, the world powers that just fought an imperialist war, you guys, you can take control over this entire region and prepare these barbarous Arabs for independence. As if they need you to fucking do that. As if they need you to fucking do that. Britain, after your colonial massacres. France, after your colonial massacres. As if they are in the moral position to be ushering these people of the Middle East into independence. Who the fuck are they? Have you noticed that whenever these Zionists make these videos, they just kind of take for granted that premise and they think, well, the British were in control of the region, man. What are you supposed to do? Why were the British in control of the region? Why does British control of the region actually mean anything to you? Because it bypasses the self-determination of the actual indigenous groups. Why should you care if the fucking British are given the mandate? It doesn't mean anything.
This area came under the British Mandate of Palestine. Two populations lived under the Mandate of Palestine, Arab and Jewish. Hello. Both of them considered Palestinians. And so, the Jewish-founded Palestine Symphony Orchestra would upon...
Again, this person is completely bypassing the fact that the indigenous Jewish Palestinians made up a very small portion of the population, and they are obscuring the fact that the majority of the Jewish population around this time were settlers. They came from Europe specifically to do settler colonialism. So the idea that they have an equal claim to the land is just not true. It's just complete bullshit. If you want to talk about the Jewish Palestinians who were in the land prior to the advent of Zionism, nobody denies that those people are indigenous to the region. What we do deny is that the Europeans who came from Ukraine and Lithuania or Russia or wherever they came from are not indigenous to the region. And in fact, they didn't come to be immigrants. They didn't come to join the existing polity. They came specifically to replace it.
Israel's independence become the Israeli Philharmonic. The Anglo-Palestine Bank would become the Israeli Leumi Bank. And this poster, that is often used today to support anti-Israel arguments, was in fact a Zionist ad promoting tourism to the Jewish homeland in Palestine.
Yeah, I think that poster was made by like an Austrian Jewish dude, a Zionist Austrian Jewish dude. That is true. That's not like a pro-Palestine, in the modern sense, pro-Palestine poster.
In 1947, the mandate expired, and the UN decided to split the land into independent Jewish and Arab states.
Again, why is the UN given the ability to decide this for an indigenous population? Who gave the UN the right? This comes after years of Zionist subjugation of the indigenous Palestinians. Once they came from Europe, they engaged in behaviors like the conquest of the labor market, which was essentially alienating Palestinians economically. They barred Palestinian goods from the market. The Zionists also appealed to the British to discard Ottoman land customs and then make it so that they could evict Palestinians who had lived in their villages for generations. The Zionist settlers were also incredibly cruel to the native Palestinians. You could see Jewish journalist Ahad Ham, who noted back in 1891 how barbaric these settlers were to the Palestinians. And then, of course, in 1917, you have the Balfour Declaration that quite literally designates the non-Jewish population of Palestine, which is the vast majority of them, by the way, as non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. It completely downgrades their existence in their own homeland, right? That's an offensive document, the Balfour Declaration. So you have all of this in the lead up to 1947 and the UN Partition Plan, UN General Assembly Resolution 181. So with all of that in mind, why did the UN have the right to force a partition on a native population? Even if none of that happened, why would the UN have the right to force this partition? Why did the UN have the right to give 56% of the land to the Jews when they made up less than a third of the population and own less than 7% of the land. That doesn't make any sense. Why did the UN have the right to place important assets like electricity and cereal harvests in the Jewish state, even when much of those assets were owned by Palestinians? That doesn't make much sense. There's a historian, Walid Khalidi, and he has a paper going over the UN General Assembly Resolution 181, the 47 partition plan, and in it, he literally calls it an economic coup de grace, because what it does is it takes the economically productive parts of the land and gives it to the Jewish state. On top of this, the Zionists never even abided by the UN plan. They ethnically cleansed Jaffa, which was supposed to be in the Arab state. They massacred the villagers of Deir Yassin in April of 1948 when the village fell within the area that the UN allotted to the International Jerusalem Zone. That was April 1948, before the Arab-Israeli War, the first Arab-Israeli War that Zionists tend to point to as though that excuses the ethnic cleansings and the massacres. No, that's not true at all. Deir Yassin was ethnically cleansed before the war. In fact, 300,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed before a single Arab state's army entered Palestine. So it's ridiculous to claim that those expulsions and those ethnic cleansings were a result of the Arab-Israeli War. They weren't. The Arab-Israeli War was the result of the ethnic cleansings. I'm sure we'll get into that later once they talk about that. Give me a fucking break.
Independent Jewish and Arab states. The Jews accepted the UN resolution and called their state Israel. The Arab world, however, rejected the two-state plan, and right after the last British soldiers departed, attacked their newly independent neighbor.
There we go. We literally just went over this. The Arabs invaded after the Zionists ethnically cleansed 300,000 Palestinians. They were answering to the cries of their citizens because at the time, the refugees that were being ethnically cleansed from Palestine were pouring into their borders and their capitals, and they thought, holy cow, aside from the humanitarian crisis that is just occurring right now, economically, how are we supposed to bear this brunt? There's so many people pouring into our borders, we need to do something. So I'm not saying that the Arab states all had, pure intentions and they all cared about the Palestinians. They didn't. Specifically Jordan, which literally colluded with the Zionists in 1947 behind the backs of the other Arab states, but we'll get into that later. The idea that the Arabs invaded just because Israel announced its independence and the UN mandate expired, that's not true. They invaded because they were responding to the cries of their citizens and the fact that the Zionist militias were ethnically cleansing their Palestinian brothers and sisters. That's what happened.
And right after the last British soldiers departed, attacked their newly independent neighbor. After the war, Jordan annexed the West Bank, and Egypt took over the Gaza Strip, which were both assigned to the Arabs as part of the partition.
So this is, I guess, we can go into what I already kind of mentioned. But Jordan was neutralized from the start. In 1947, the Hashemite kingdom made a deal with the Zionists not to actually fight Israel in the event of a war, and they would get the West Bank for themselves. That was the deal that they made in 1947. So then when the war happened, they abided by that. They confined their military efforts strictly to the West Bank, and they held on to that. That's what happened. This was actually a massive blow for the war effort since Jordan's army was the most powerful in the Arab world. It was the Arab Legion. It was trained by the British. It was the most powerful army involved in this war, and it was neutralized from the start. So the idea that you could just treat all Arabs as this monolithic blob, it's completely ahistorical, and it doesn't answer for the fact the actors involved in this conflict all had different interests and acted in their own self-interests, in the case of Jordan above all else. I like your commentary on this video, but I don't like how they used AI to make it. I don't think they used AI to make it. It looks like just kind of shitty cartoon, no? Yeah, I don't think it's AI because they would have to have tagged it as AI in this video, right?
Plan. Neither country saw a need to set up an independent state in these areas. As a result, an Arab state did not materialize in the former British mandate of Palestine.
Yeah, it's like, oh, okay, neither of the Arab states decided to set up a Palestinian state in Gaza or the West Bank. Yeah, because they had their own selfish motivations. Arabs are not interchangeable. King Abdullah of Jordan was a Zionist collaborator, as we've been over. Jordan illegally annexed the West Bank in 1950. It's strange to act as though just because the Jordanian government was Arab, that means automatically that they had the Palestinians' best interests at heart. That's racist.
Palestinian identity continued to grow after 1950.
Overzealots, how do you respond to Zionists who say there was no Palestinian state in 1967, therefore no Palestinian state should exist? First of all, first and foremost, the concept of a nation state was a European construction, predominantly European construction, and it was imposed on to the MENA region. So when the MENA region was compartmentalizing into little nation states, Palestine was precluded from being able to do so because of the Nakba, because of the ethnic cleansings, because of the Zionist settler colonialism that they were the victims of. So if then you fast forward to 1967, where the Palestinian state was precluded from ever being able to exist, it's kind of strange then to say in 1967, once the Israelis assume control of the occupied territories and take it from Egypt and Jordan, it's kind of strange to say then, well, a Palestinian state never existed, so why should it now? I don't know. Because it was never allowed to exist? They have national aspirations for self-determination, so why are they not allowed to follow through with that? You can see in 1911, there was a Palestinian newspaper. It was a Jaffa-based newspaper. It was called Palestine. They used the name Palestine, and they expressed their nationalist desires. You had the Palestinian Arab Congress, back in the 1920s, 1930s, saying, well, how come Iraq's mandate is explicitly promising to usher Iraq into an independent nation state with a parliamentary democracy? We want that. We want equality with that mandate. So you have a clear paper trail of Palestinians decades going back. As soon as a nation state was even an entertainable concept, you have a paper trail of Palestinians saying, we want that. Why can't we have that? Everyone else is getting it. So they've been expressing a desire for it, but they've been precluded by force from being able to do it. But then it's strange in 1967 to argue, well, they never had a nation state before. Why should they have one now? Nation states come and go all of the time, whenever. What about Kosovo? Kosovo is fairly new. Came in 2008. What about South Sudan? That came in 2011. Are they allowed to exist because they didn't exist hitherto, but now they do? It's weird. It's a weird argument to make.
Palestinian identity continued to grow after 1948, culminating in 1964 when the Arab League initiated the creation of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, declaring this Arab group the Palestinian people.
No, they did not deem the PLO the Palestinian people. They deemed the PLO the representative of the Palestinian people. Okay? I think the exact phrase that they used was the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, something like that. The reason this video is framing things like this is to subconsciously put forth the idea that the Palestinians aren't a real people, and instead they're entirely embodied by this group. That's bullshit. That's Zionist propaganda. They never ever said that the PLO was the Palestinian people. The sole representative, the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. That's what they said. I don't know why you can't just say that in your video if you're not trying to be dishonest.
The PLO demanded the entire area of the mandate, though it called for the destruction of Israel, but did not challenge Jordanian and Egyptian rule. Arab aspirations continued to focus.
They did challenge Jordanian rule. That's kind of strange. Like the PFLP especially did. They called Jordan colonized by the Hashemite family. It's just ridiculous to say that they didn't. There was actually Palestinian radicals who put forth the idea that in order to liberate Palestine, they had to first liberate Jordan from the Hashemite kingdom. This culminated in 1970 when Jordan literally expelled the PLO. So what are you talking about? They didn't challenge Jordanian rule. That's bullshit.
Solely on eliminating the state of Israel, instigating another war in 1967, in which Israel gained control over the former Mandate territories in the West Bank and...
So they're saying that the Arabs instigated the Six-Day War. Interesting. Let's, I have a little segment on the Six-Day War and how it was started by Israel. It was an illegal war of aggression started by Israel. Let's head over to Israel's southwestern border and examine the situation with Egypt leading up to the Six-Day War. In May 1967, Gamal Abdel Nasser moved his troops into the Sinai Peninsula and closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping in a move known as brinksmanship. This was more of a political strategy than a military one, and Nasser did this in part because he was operating off faulty Soviet intelligence warning of an imminent Israeli attack on Syria at a time when Egypt and Syria had signed a mutual defense pact. Though, given what we just went over regarding Moshe Dayan's admission that his forces were responsible for 80% of the clashes with Syria, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility to believe that the Israelis would continue similar actions. Another reason for this move by Nasser, and historians argue that this was actually his main motive, was an attempt to assert dominance and uphold his credibility as the leader of Arab nationalism at a time when he was being taunted by conservative monarchies in the region for supposedly being weak toward Israel and hiding behind UN forces. Avi Shlaim even states that Nasser didn't even believe the Soviet intelligence report and that he was primarily trying to save face in the region and uphold his credibility at a time when it was being challenged.
He wanted to preserve his credibility without actually going to war with Israel because he knew he would lose. As Avi Shlaim put it, there is general agreement among commentators that Nasser neither wanted nor planned to go to war with Israel. He had a third of his troops bogged down in Yemen, and Egypt was just in no position to fight a war. The Israelis knew this, and they capitalized on it. They launched a surprise attack on Egypt and Syria, which destroyed their air forces on the tarmac and precluded the Arab states from having any air superiority, hence the quick Israeli victory. But the issue is, this was clearly not defensive, and key Israeli figures were well aware of that fact. The CIA, the Pentagon, and Israeli intelligence unanimously concluded that Egypt's deployments did not mean Nasser was going to attack. U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara straight up told Israel's foreign minister Abba Eban that an Egyptian attack was not imminent, with U.S. President...
So, going back to the video that we're reacting to, the primary video that we're reacting to, the Zionist one, they said that the Arabs instigated the Six-Day War. But then you have the sources that are actually tasked at the time with acquiring the intel saying, no, the Arabs are not trying to attack. An attack is not imminent. In fact, if they did attack, you would whip the hell out of them. This is the information that Israel is accruing at the time. And Lyndon B. Johnson adding that if war were to break out, Israel would whip the hell out of its opponents. At the same time, the head of Israel's own intelligence service, Mossad, told McNamara that there were no differences between the US and the Israelis on the military intelligence picture or its interpretation. So the Americans are saying, hey, you guys are not in any danger. The Arabs are not going to attack. And then the head of Mossad, the agency literally tasked with assessing such situations, says, yeah, you guys are right. We don't have any information that contradicts what you're saying.
Once the potential Egyptian threat was ruled out, the Israelis got to work securing the green light from the US to attack Egypt. Both the Israelis and Americans knew that if Israel were to strike, they would win a war against all the Arab states combined. So McNamara gave Mir Amit, the Mossad chief, the green light. As you can see, it wasn't about self-defense. It was about striking the Arab states when they were unprepared so Israel could engage in its favorite pastimes of war and territorial expansionism. And this isn't just my opinion. It's the opinion of prominent Israeli figures who have admitted as much. Yitzhak Rabin, then a general, acknowledged that the Israeli leadership at the time of the war didn't view Nasser's troop concentrations as a threat and that he believed Nasser didn't want war. Ezer Weizman, the former commander of the Air Force, said that there was no threat of destruction coming from Egypt, and he cited two other generals who corroborated his claim. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who was in the 60s.
Shlaim argues in this book that the Iron Wall of the Six-Day War was defensive. Yeah, so Avi Shlaim was a Zionist when he wrote the Iron Wall. So depending on what version you get, you'll get varying degrees of liberal Zionism, but he has completely abandoned his old positions. If you read his new memoir, he literally says he abandons his old positions, he embraces a single-state solution. Even in that book, it's really funny, you can kind of see that contradiction. He goes, everybody knew that Nasser's concentrations were not offensive, but then he still will try and defend the legitimacy of Israel within the 67 borders. That was really his position up until the genocide in Gaza, where he abandoned it and he went back on it. If you actually read the book, he literally says, yeah, the Israelis were not being threatened. But what he tries to do to kind of salvage the Israeli project in that book is he tries to say that what ended up happening was the generals, the IDF, kind of pressured Levi Eshkol into going along with everything. And then as everything was going on, Levi Eshkol and the cabinet got a taste for expansionism, and then something switched, and then they went full, expansionist. But that's undermined when you look at the Shaham Plan, which Shlaim does not mention in the Iron Wall. The Shaham Plan was a plan that was put forth, and it put forth a plan of how the Israelis could manage the territories in the event of a takeover, and then they did just that. So that would be the issue there. If you want to really get a true understanding of the Six-Day War, I would recommend the book, The Six-Day War in Israeli Self-Defense by John Quigley, because John Quigley actually cites the relevant laws. Now, aside from Avi Shlaim's assessment in that book, which is his conclusion is bad, but his information pertaining to the mindset of Israelis is accurate. Like, none of them thought that they were going to be attacked. Like, they just weren't. Nasser's concentrations were more so defensive in character because he was part of a mutual defense pact with Syria, and the Israelis were attacking the Syrians. And in that very book, in chapter 6 of the Iron Wall, which is the chapter that he tackles it, he literally has a transcript of an interview that Moshe Dayan gave in 1976, where he admitted that 80% of the clashes on the Syrian border were instigated by Israel. So if Israel was constantly instigating with the Syrians, and Syrians were bound to Egypt by a mutual defense pact, how could it be a defensive war if Israel was the one initiating 80% of those clashes? Regardless, even if Israel felt as though they needed to act in self-defense, you have to first exhaust diplomacy as per Article 33 of the UN Charter, which Israel did not do. In fact, Nasser was actively involved in trying to remedy the situation diplomatically at the time, but Israel cut short his initiatives and his participation and his cooperation by attacking, by striking. That's illegal. Article 2 of the UN Charter states that member states cannot just use force against one another. Israel discarded that as well. And then on top of that, the only way that you can really use force or resort to war would be in line with either Article 51 that says you have to be defending from an armed attack, or Article 42, which states that you have to get a green light from the Security Council. Israel did not get the Security Council green light. Israel was not the victim of an armed attack. So they had no legal footing for this war, regardless of what Avi Shleim's final conclusion was in that book.
7 cabinet reflected on the Six-Day War years later and openly admitted, in June 1967, we again had a choice. The Egyptian army concentrations and the Sinai approaches do not prove that Nasser was really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him. Even Levi Eshkol, the sitting prime minister of Israel during the 1967 Six-Day War, didn't seem to believe Israel was in any real danger, and he was being pressured by his generals to launch a war against the Arab states. Eshkol openly said on May 27, 1967, while addressing the army's general staff, I do not accept that the mere fact that the Egyptian army is deployed in Sinai makes war inevitable. We are not alone in the world. Are we to live all our lives by the sword?
Once the prime minister of Israel at the time, himself admitting, yeah, Nasser's concentrations do not mean he's going to attack. I don't think he's going to attack.
The Israeli cabinet voted in favor of launching an aggressive attack on its neighbors, and it became clear that the coming strike would be far from defensive. Levi Eshkol switched up, and he took part in a plan to frame Israel as the victim so the international community wouldn't turn against it. He helped fabricate a cover story to make it seem as though Egypt had struck first. Now, if Israel truly were defending itself and he was confident in that fact, why would there be any need to invent a dishonest narrative? And why would Moshe Dayan order military censorship over the Israeli first strike and talk about crafting a story where the Israelis have to be the victims for the first 24 hours? It's because the Israelis knew that their war was not only unnecessary, but illegal. Under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, you can't just start a war unless you're defending from an actual armed attack. Armed is an important word because Zionists will pretend as though the closure of the Straits of Tiran was a casus belli for Israel, despite the UN Charter not affirming that position.
Also, back in 1967, the way that armed attack was interpreted in the UN Charter was a literal interpretation, because none of the jurisprudence that we have today to color our understanding of what an armed attack is existed in 1967. The legal framework that we rely on today to interpret what constitutes an armed attack would be the 1974 UNGA Resolution 3314, the 1994 San Remo Manual, and the 1986 Nicaragua vs. USA case. None of that existed in 1967. Therefore, the way armed attack was interpreted was a literal definition. Unless Israel was the recipient of an actual literal armed attack, it did not have any legal basis for this war. And despite the fact that the head of Mossad acknowledged to Secretary McNamara that passage through the Straits of Tiran was not crucial for Israel. Even the US State Department's legal advisor, Leonard Meeker, concluded that the closure of the strait did not constitute an armed attack, as John Quigley, author of The Six-Day War and Israeli Self-Defense, noted. And when it comes to the legality of preemptive strikes under customary international law, our understanding is colored by the 1837 Caroline test, which states that a preemptive strike or an act of anticipatory self-defense is only justified if the necessity of self-defense is instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. Under this standard, a country can't strike based on a vague or distant fear. The threat must be a palpable, imminent attack that can't be deterred by any means other than war. Obviously, when discussing Israel's attack in 1967, this wasn't the case. Not even the Israelis could stick to the script. Many of their prominent officials admitted that they were in no danger, admitted that they knew Nasser didn't want war, and they even felt the need to make up a fake story about Egypt striking first, only giving up on that lie once they achieved their military aims. That's not what self-defense looks like. There we go. So the idea that the Arabs started the war in 1967, just not true. Just not borne out in the historical record.
Territories in the West Bank and Gaza. So, are these historical claims about the Palestinians true?
لم تمر حقبة في التاريخ خلت من وجود الشعب الفلسطيني في هذه الأرض.
السيد المسيح كان الفلسطيني الأول الذي عذب في هذه الأرض.
No, these claims are false. Jesus was born 134 years before the Romans changed the name of Judea.
I mean, like we already been over, the name was already in use before that. We have no evidence, no concrete evidence that Hadrian gave the decree to name the province Syria-Palestina specifically to spite the Jews. The name was in use prior to that, way before that, actually. We've already been over this.
To Palestine, over 1900 years before it became the name of the British Mandate, and almost 2,000 years before it was widely adopted by an Arab population in the region. He was, however, a Jew, living in the Kingdom of Judea. All his
Jesus was, in fact, Jewish. I don't know if you guys knew that.
history put aside, Israel and the international community have endorsed Palestinian national aspirations through repeated peace offers based on a two-state solution. Unfortunately for everyone in the region, Palestinian and Arab leaders have rejected all of these offers.
Wrong. Huge lie. All right, let's take it step by step. 1937 Peel Commission. This was put forth by the British to split the land. They were actually going to give the majority of the land to the Arab state this time, but again, the British had no right to force a partition on a native population, especially a partition with a group of settler colonists. And then if you add on to this the fact that the land that the Peel Commission envisioned For the Jewish state, it was the more fertile land, the economically productive land. You can corroborate that by reading Eugene Rogan, The Arabs: A History. On top of that, the Zionist leadership at the time formally rejected the Peel Commission. They formally rejected it. So it's actually untrue to say that either side agreed to the Peel Commission. The Zionists formally rejected the specifics of the Peel Commission. What they did accept was the principle of partition, but that acceptance of the principle of partition came along with an admission from David Ben-Gurion, who wrote to a letter to his son saying, we will temporarily accept partition just so that we can get the foot in the door and then expel the Arabs when time allows for it. That's what he said in the same year to his son in a letter. The Jewish side did not agree to the Peel Commission. They formally rejected it. They accepted the principle of partition only as a stepping stone to work towards their goal of expelling the Palestinians and abolishing the partition and colonizing all of Palestine. The UN partition proposal, UNGA Resolution 181, we already been over that. They offered 56% of the land to the Jewish state, despite the fact that Jewish people at the time made up, a third of the population, owned less than 7% of the land. Made absolutely no sense for the UN to force this partition onto the indigenous population. And aside from that, the Zionists didn't even abide by it anyways, right? They ethnically cleansed Jaffa, they attacked the village of Deir Yassin. All of this fell outside of the state that the UN proposed for the Jewish side. Just didn't work. I mean, even David Ben-Gurion said at the time, there can be no Jewish state with a Jewish majority of only 60%, completely contradicting the UN partition plan, because the UN partition plan envisioned that the Jewish state would have a sizable Arab minority living within it. But the Zionist leadership, David Ben-Gurion, openly took issue with this. He negated that principle from the start. It's not right to say that the Zionists agreed to the UN partition plan either. They formally, verbally agreed to it, but they didn't follow it. They didn't try to implement it. No, they started ethnically cleansing before the war. They were ethnically cleansing the proposed Arab state. They were ethnically cleansing the international Jerusalem zone, and they were ethnically cleansing within their state when they weren't supposed to do that. They were supposed to allow for a sizable Arab minority within it. 2000 Camp David Summit. The prime minister who oversaw the 2000 Camp David Summit was Ehud Barak. Okay, so at this point, the consensus, the international consensus for the peace process was Israel's withdrawal to the pre-1967 borders with, if anything, minor modifications, and the agreement to implement or work towards the implementation of Security Council Resolution 242, which posits the Israelis will withdraw from the land in exchange for peace. Now, that resolution was agreed to by the PLO in 1988 in Algiers. As I just said, the international consensus was for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories if they genuinely were interested in peace. Now, Ehud Barak, in his opening speech in 1999, openly said in his first speech, under no circumstances will I ever withdraw to the pre-67 borders. So he fundamentally negated the peace process in his first speech, okay? Aside from that, he built more settlements in the West Bank than Netanyahu did, who served a prime ministership prior to him. He called for a unified Jerusalem in perpetuity, meaning he was going to permanently annex Arab East Jerusalem, right? He colonized the West Bank 10 times faster than Netanyahu, and funnily enough, Camp David, the Camp David Summit, the final leg of this, Camp David peace process. It goes the Camp David Summit, it goes the Clinton parameters, which were an attempt to salvage the failed Camp David Summit, where Ehud Barak didn't even write anything down and just verbally offered a quote-unquote generous offer that wasn't even a generous offer because it didn't allow real statehood for the Palestinians. But in order to save that failed Camp David Summit, Bill Clinton offered the Clinton parameters, which was a set of parameters. It was like what Bill Clinton envisioned could be bridging proposal between the two sides. And the Palestinians agreed to go along with this with reservations, and the Israelis agreed to go along with this with reservations. But Clinton openly admitted on January 2nd, 2001, that Arafat was going along and cooperating with these parameters and was willing to see through the implementation of some sort of peace accord predicated on these parameters. And he said this to Ehud Barak over the phone, January 2nd, 2001. And guess what Ehud Barak said, the guy who's purportedly the peace dove, who is interested in having some sort of peace with the Palestinians. You know what he said? I'm not interested in concluding an accord with Arafat before my prime ministership is over. So you have the supposed peace prime minister openly admitting to Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton tells him that Arafat is taking it seriously, that he doesn't want to take it seriously. And on top of all this, the Clinton parameters were supposed to be presented in September of 2000. And Ehud Barak pressured Bill Clinton to withhold them, to prevent him from putting them forward until December of 2000. So if you're a peace guy and you're genuinely interested in having some sort of peace accord, why are you telling Bill Clinton not to put forth the peace proposals, knowing that in January of the next year, both Clinton and Ehud Barak leave office for good? Why wouldn't you want to speed up that process? Put them forward. And then when he does put them forward and Arafat's cooperating with them, he says, I don't have any intention to conclude an accord. What's after that? 2008, Annapolis process. That would be the Ehud Olmert offer. Olmert was a lame duck prime minister, and he most likely didn't have the constitutional power to even follow through the potential peace offering he was putting forth. He never let Mahmoud Abbas, take home the map to show his specialists, and Olmert tried to rush Abbas into an agreement when there were still issues between them. Now, you tell me, if you are trying to rush some sort of peace accord and you present this map to your interlocutor and they're supposed to make a decision predicated on that map, why would you not allow your interlocutor to take the map home, to study it, to consult his or her experts on it, since it permanently affects them? Why would you not let him do that? And the reason he didn't want the Mahmoud Abbas to bring the map home is because he was worried that Mahmoud Abbas would pocket it and then use it as a starting point for future negotiations when Olmert was no longer in office, so Olmert wouldn't get the credit for it. That was the reason. So yeah, he never let Abbas take the map home. And then when the process inevitably failed, Olmert claimed that it was because he never heard back from the Palestinians, when this was not true. And the Palestinians actually asked for clarifications that they never received. And on top of this, Tzivi Lipni, who was the number 2 in Kadima was Olmert's party, was reportedly telling Abbas to hold off from accepting Olmert's plan because when she became head of the party, she would offer Abbas something better. So the number 2 in Kadima telling Abbas not to follow through with Olmert's plan, but he still did. He still requested clarifications and he never received them. Abbas, he never received the clarifications. Despite that, the Zionist narrative posits that it was yet again some sort of Palestinian intransigence where the Palestinians walked away. That's bullshit. They requested clarification. They never received it. That's what happened in 2008.
Everyone in the region, Palestinian and Arab leaders have rejected all of these offers. They continue to make false historical claims, hoping to erase Jewish ties and deny Jewish rights in this region.
It's so funny because the only group that is actively trying to deny or erase the history of another group is the Zionists to the Palestinians. Like we've been over, the Palestinians have a much stronger ancestral genetic link to the land, DNA link to the land, if that's what you care about, which is not actually something I care about, to be honest. But if that's the argument that you want to go for, and Zionists love going for that argument, the Palestinians have a much stronger claim to the land than especially Ashkenazi Jews. Much stronger. So it's ridiculous. There's only one group actively trying to prevent another group from practicing their national self-determination, and that is the Israelis to the Palestinians. And then they say promote peace for both peoples, not lies that drive them apart, when this video was 4 minutes and 47 seconds of pure lies.